My name's Sam Nutt, and this story actually begins in the 1970s when my parents returned to Canada after a 5-year posting in Africa. And I was an infant when we'd left Toronto, which is where I was born. And so coming back to Canada at the age of 6, well, you couldn't call me a newcomer. I was nevertheless utterly unfamiliar with this country. The neighborhood we moved into at the time was as old as I was. It was the kind of newly built housing development that is nestled beside a busy 400 series highway, which became the white noise of my childhood. And my friends and I, we were a mix of first-generation kids from Italian, Greek, Scottish, Portuguese, Eastern European, Indian, and Caribbean families. And we would ride around those streets, hanging off the back of our banana seat bikes, helmetless, through endless summer days and nights. And we would return home when someone was hungry or bleeding, or maybe both. And you know, that's just how kids were raised in the 70s and into the early 80s. It is a miracle there are any Gen Xers left alive at all. And what did that freedom do? It turned us into the kind of hyper-vigilant parents who bubble wrap their kids every time they leave the house. From one extreme, another is always born. And so coming from Africa, I was a pro at summer. I've faced it shoeless and bronze-skinned like Jodie Foster in that Coppertone baby ad. I also hardly ever wore clothes. Like ever wore clothes. Never. My poor mother, she tried, unsuccessfully. And it turns out that Canadians are a little more prudish than Africans when it comes to nudity. Perhaps it's our climate. You know, at a certain point, if you don't cover things up, they might just fall off. But in any event, I owned that first summer in the nut house. By fall, I was ready to renounce my citizenship. Without warning, the banana seats were crudely packed in the back of the garage to make room for school books written in a strange foreign language, French. My parents had chosen an immersion school back when Trudeau, the other one, was making them popular, and when it all seemed like a giant Skinner experiment. The teachers refused to address the children in English, which I am not sure did much for my French proficiency, but certainly instilled in me a lifelong sensitivity to other people's facial expressions, especially ones that imply I'm an idiot. Sadly, though, tragedy loomed. One day, in late November, the most horrifying, terrible thing happened. It snowed. I watched it from our second-story window and shouted, "Mom! Come quick, the clouds are broken!" Now, I knew something about this. I had read Chicken Little, the older English version, you know, the one where the fox eats them all in the end, right? Good night, moon, it was not. And instead of making things better, my mother did the unthinkable. She stuffed me into a giant sleeping bag with legs and shoved me out the front door. "Your first Canadian winter, honey, have fun." And she declared this in that maternal way that let me know this was not open to interpretation. And I was filled with panic and dread and possibly pee, because that's what happens the moment you stick a kid in a snowsuit. And in that moment, I did what I imagined legions of new Canadians have done when faced with snow for the very first time. I ate it. That's right, I stuck out my tongue and scarfed down those snowflakes like a frog in a fly swarm. And I was a tenacious child, and I didn't quit until I had eaten my way through the entire driveway. One small step for the preservation of humankind. My exasperated mother eventually yelled from the front door, "Sam, for God's sake, will you stop eating the snow and just play in it like a normal Canadian child?" So in my quest to figure out and become a normal Canadian, here's what I've learned. We are, to be sure, a country that is resoundingly polite, so long as you never find yourself in Toronto during rush hour. We are suspicious of political extremes and for the most part tend to land in the center, thus avoiding much of the pageantry and insanity that so frequently afflicts our southern neighbors, even if our own democracy could benefit from a few renovations, something I find politicians like to talk about before they move in, but then seem content to abandon once they've unpacked the boxes. At least the roof isn't leaking. We don't possess nuclear weapons and don't aspire to, because as long as it remains possible to blow the world up 15,000 times over, we figure nobody wins. We don't start protracted wars in foreign lands, then close our borders to the very people threatened and displaced by them. At least, we try not to. And we believe that healthcare should be free and available to everyone, mostly, whereas guns should not, ideally. We also advocate for tolerance and diplomacy over nativism and pugilistic ultimatums, though not always, and only when it doesn't compete with our economic interests, or how else to explain a $15 billion arms deal to one of the most notoriously despotic and human rights abusing countries in the world. Similarly, we champion peace, humanitarianism, and good governance on a global stage, but as long as it's not too expensive. At a time when the world is facing the worst refugee and famine crisis since World War II, our contributions to humanitarian spending have declined to 1/4% of our national wealth. 1/4%, even though the UN target of 0.7% was set by our very own Lester B. Pearson in 1969. We pay tribute to our First Nations communities at official events, and we launch public inquiries, and we craft heartfelt apologies, but 1/4 of them still persist under a boil water advisory. Indigenous women are missing and murdered at rates far above the national average, and children on reserve remain up to 4 times more likely to die by the age of 5 than other Canadian children. These are the irreconcilable addendums to our nation's good intentions, and if we desire a better country, there can be no better places to start. This is the birthday of one particular and rather exclusive Canadian story, 150 years since Confédération. It is a time to gather the friends, haul out the red and white, crack open a beer. But there's one thing about birthdays after a certain age. Beneath the veneer of self-satisfaction, there's a disquiet about the many things we'd hoped we'd be by now, but have yet to figure out. No matter how old we get or how successful, there is room to grow, improve, and make amends. I've changed a lot since my snow-eating days in all ways but one. Those worlds beyond our borders remain an indelible part of me, and I can't shake them. War zones in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, places that are at once beautiful and perilous and complicated and heartbreaking. And I have made and lost far too many friends in those corners of the world, and on a few occasions, that violence has almost claimed me. But through it all, there has been one constant, and my sanity and my reprieve, and that's this. Canada is my home, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Thank you very much.